Hello, welcome back to Let's Talk Title with Emerald Coast Title Services. I'm president of ECTS, Dion Moniz.
And I'm Ashley Bowen, a licensed title agent and the director of operations for Emerald Coast Title Services.
All right, so today we're going to get into the mechanics of seller financing for these purchase deals and explain how it works and whether it's good or not, and
so it can be good.
Some alternatives to that.
It can be good. There are advantages for both the seller and the buyer. Sometimes the seller could possibly enjoy a higher sales price because they're giving the buyer the opportunity to buy a house that they may not otherwise have.
Because typically seller financing doesn't come into the picture unless the buyer can't get a traditional loan, right? And so they have to start getting creative.
Typically, that's why. But also, another advantage for the seller would be, I do believe that there's some tax advantages as opposed to getting one big lump sum. You're getting a steady stream of payments over time.
Yep.
So that could be a reason, and the seller may want to do seller financing as opposed to outright sell it.
Yeah, no, great point.
And also, you could have an interest rate of a steady 6% as opposed to in your money market where it could go from 5.5 to 3 or.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I've had sellers that were investors that said, I don't need the money up front. I'd rather just have it come in as a stream, almost like an annuity, and they're getting a decent interest rate, and they're, spreading out the taxes. They're not deferring the taxes, but they're just spreading out the impact of the taxes.
And it's kind of a firm deal, it's not like the stock market where you could lose $500,000 in a day.
Yeah.
You're going to get that steady income each month. And there are some advantages for a buyer. Typically with a conventional loan, you've got to put 20% down, where there are no regulations with seller financing as to how much you can put down. The seller could finance the entire purchase price.
Yep.
And if the buyer, like you said, has poor credit and cannot get a traditional loan, this may be the only option for them.
Yeah, exactly. Now, there's some things you have to do to protect the seller in the seller finance situation, and so you're, of course, going to have the promissory note, which is the debt instrument.
But in the seller financing, first, it is a deed. Like the seller sells the property to the buyer, and we record a warranty deed, and now the buyer is the owner of the property, and the seller only has a security interest in the mortgage.
Correct.
Which is...
So that's a disadvantage, because if for some reason the buyer defaults, then the seller has to go through a foreclosure process. Now, at the end of the day, the seller is still going to be made whole through the foreclosure, but it could end up being 8, 12, 16 months in court, depending on whether the buyer fights it. And then, several $1,000s in attorney's fees, which will get added to the judgment amount at the end of the day, but it's still time and aggravation to have to deal with that. So that's a disadvantage for the seller.
But typically, in a seller financing, we have a promissory note and a mortgage, and that's it. If it's just an individual from an individual, right?
Correct. Whereas if the buyer is going to be an LLC, then you're going to have, or I'm going to recommend, a guarantee agreement as well, where the entity is the borrower on the note, then you have your mortgage, and then you have a personal guarantee where the principal or principals of the LLC or entity guarantee the note. So they're on the hook as well.
Okay.
And that is something that we do a lot of at ECTS. Since I'm a lawyer, I can draft those docs. Now I do it through the law firm side, and so the law firm gets paid attorney's fees, but that is something that we can do in-house and do it a lot.
We do it a lot, and you're pretty quick about it usually.
Most times.
Well, and I'm able to provide you with the title commitment and all of that stuff, and so it makes it a little bit easier if we work together on those things.
Yep.
But if I give you 2 weeks, you can get it done, and that's a lot quicker than a traditional bank, which would be 30 days to 45 days.
Yeah, I mean, in a push, I can get it done in 24 hours.
And your attorney fees is the only loan fees, as opposed to a traditional loan where you will have origination, underwriting, doc prep, all kinds of other things. Flood cert, tax service fees, the list goes on and on.
Yeah, it's way cheaper.
But so what happens about escrows, though? The buyer take that back. The seller needs to ensure that those property taxes get paid each year, or if they don't, then there could be a tax deed sale and everybody loses the property.
Yes, and so generally the mortgage will have language putting that burden on the borrower or the buyer, and if the taxes aren't paid, that's a default. So there's some teeth in there to where the seller can hold the buyer's feet to the fire and make sure those taxes are paid, but the seller still needs to be
watching it.
Watch it, yeah, because they're not going to get notices. Notices are going to go to the buyer, the borrower, and so yeah, seller, you need to be checking annually to make sure the taxes are paid. Before I can't remember how long it is before they'll actually sell off a tax certificate.
I think it's 3 years.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. But every April you should be checking to make sure that they were paid.
Exactly.
But also with homeowners insurance, the seller, I would want that property to stay insured, because if there were some type of a fire or other casualty loss, the seller doesn't have anything either if they lost property too.
Right, exactly.
So generally, can you escrow for taxes and insurance on a seller financing deal?
I mean, you can. There are servicing companies out there that'll handle that for you and charge a fee. Obviously, it's not something we want to do as an escrow agent. That's outside of what we like to do as escrow agent. But yeah, there are third-party vendors, so to speak, that will do that for you. What you can do on the insurance side is you can make sure that the policy has the clause in it that requires notice of cancellation to be sent to the seller within 30 days of it lapsing. And that allows the seller to
go insure it if they need to.
Go insure it, force place insurance. And again, there's going to be a clause in the mortgage that says if you don't maintain insurance, it's a default. So those are the remedies that are available for the seller, but it does require the seller to be diligent.
Okay. All right.
But used a lot and can be very beneficial.
It is used a lot. Now, sometimes though, we have had like a lease with option to purchase. In what situation would you do that as opposed to seller financing?
So that kind of kicks the can down the road a little bit. And a lease with purchase option, you can have all or part of the rent kind of act as a credit towards the purchase price. So if and when at the end of the lease or within the option term, if the tenant/buyer decides to trigger the option, then all that rent that's been paid over the years can be credited towards the purchase price, depending on how the option is worded. And so I guess it gives the buyer some additional time where they can be in the property as the tenant and live there, but maybe they're not quite ready to buy yet for whatever reason. The lease payments might be lower than the finance payments would be, so it lets them build up some additional time and capital to pull the trigger on the purchase option.
And then once they do the purchase option, it would be a traditional closing where they would likely go get a loan from someone other than the seller to pay it off. Okay.
Yeah. Although I've done lease with purchase options to where the seller still financed it when the option was triggered. So it just depends on, whether seller wants the money all up front or over time.
Okay. And then the lease with purchase option is the same thing as rent to own, basically, right?
Yep, exactly.
And then what is an agreement for deed?
Yeah, so this vehicle used to be used a lot. It's not used as much anymore, but they're still recognized. The courts treat it as a mortgage, but it's an agreement that allows the buyer to live at the house. The property appraiser treats it as buyer's property, even though title hasn't formally conveyed. So ultimately it says, hey, John Doe, you're going to pay me XYZ payments over this specific amount of time. So it's almost got promissory note language within the agreement. And once all those payments are made, then the seller agrees to deed the property to the buyer. So it's an agreement for deed. Once you pay all these payments, I agree to give you a deed.
So it's like seller financing, but with the deed happening at the end instead of the beginning.
Yes, exactly. And so that keeps the property legally in the seller's name. So that way, if the buyer defaults, seller's not having to file a foreclosure action.
Okay.
So it's easier to get the property back because it never left.
So all you have to do is file a termination of agreement for deed.
Exactly. Yeah, and you can sue them under the agreement like you would a promissory note for the damages if you want, or just say, you know what, the agreement's terminated. I'm keeping all the money you've given me so far. Have a nice day. And then there's no chasing title to the property. So more beneficial on the seller side in that situation.
Okay.
And then depending on the circumstances, you can put language in the agreement that either lets, I'm going to say buyer, even though he hasn't bought it yet. But anyway, lets the buyer make improvements or can't make improvements without seller's consent. So there's all kinds of ways or clauses you can put in those agreements to make it work depending on what the parties want. But yeah, that is an option to seller financing.
Okay. So there are a bunch of different options for seller financing.
Yeah.
So if you are going to do seller financing, in the traditional way, I think you would definitely want to use Rider C. It's the FAR bar contract. That's the seller financing rider. And in it has all this Dodd-Frank Act language.
Yes.
And then it says the loan amount, where you put it in at this blank interest rate, amortized over blank, and it defaults to 30 years. And so definitely use that rider.
Yep.
Check in the financing section that you're going to do 2C, which is the purchase money mortgage to seller, which is the same thing as seller financing. And then use your rider. And then when you submit the contract to us with the rider, then all I have to do is send it to Dion and say, hey, you got to draft some loan documents.
Yep, exactly. And something to keep in mind if you're an investor, that you do this a lot. If the buyer is going to take title as an LLC, it's considered a commercial loan, so you don't have to worry about Dodd-Frank and all that. But if they're taking title in their individual names and they're going to live there as their primary residence, you can only do 3 of those before you're considered a lender. And if you're considered a lender, you're subject to all the Dodd-Frank laws, which is a nightmare. So it's better to sell to an LLC if you're going to do seller financing. If you're not, make sure you don't do more than 3 to individuals.
3 a year or 3 ever?
It's 3 outstanding at any given time. So,
okay.
I mean, if it's a 30-year mortgage.
Yeah, 3 ever probably.
Yeah. It's a 5-year balloon, then, once it balloons and it's paid off, then, it opens up that slot for another one, yeah.
Okay, well, good to know.
Yep.
Thanks for that legal advice.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Did we cover everything we needed to?
I think so. I think that people should be able to get some snippets of information from this. And if you didn't get what you needed, then you can call us at 850-650-0077, and we can get the answers for you.
Yep. And as I said earlier, we draft all those documents, so that's something we can provide. And you can even work it out to where your agent still gets a commission if you're doing one of the alternatives where it's not being purchased right away. The agreement for deed or the lease with purchase option.
We've done where the agent got paid commission at the signing of the agreement for deed, and then the rest of the commission upon satisfaction of the agreement for deed.
Yep, exactly.
And also with your attorney fees for drafting these loan documents, typically the FAR bar contract says that loan expenses are a buyer's expense, but everything's negotiable, and you can always split that attorney fee so that each party pays some of it.
Yep, exactly. All right, well, that's going to do it for this episode. We appreciate you listening or watching, and like Ashley said, call us if you need us. And in the meantime, we'll say goodbye. Bye-bye.